Evening, brothers and sisters. I'm going to start by doing something that's just a wee bit dangerous. Something that I wouldn't recommend under any circumstance. I'm going to start by publicly disobeying my father-in-law. Now, I know you're shocked. You're particularly shocked. He is a rather large man. My first encounters with him, when I was just trying to kiss his daughter, I did get threatened with physical violence. You'll be glad to know our relationship has improved since then. Why am I publicly disobeying my father-in-law? It's a good question. He's one of the leaders of this community, and the guy who has organised everyone who has spoken at these Thursday night meetings for the last couple of years. And he gives you a remit. You only have to do two things in these talks. One, you have to give a talk. And two, you have to focus on one of the names or titles of Jesus. Tonight, I'm going to do neither. We'll see if I make it out of the hall. Why am I doing this? When I was preparing for tonight, I started to pray about it, and a thought came to mind that I thought, I could speak about that, but I immediately discarded it. I discarded it because, one, it wasn't a talk, and two, it was about a topic that we actually focused on less than 2 months ago. But as I prayed about it and I looked at other topics, other titles of Jesus that I could have spoken about, I just got nowhere. I wasn't making any progress. And my mind just kept coming back to this, kept coming back to it again and again. So I prayed about what I'm going to say tonight, and my conviction that I'm supposed to say it rose. Tonight, I simply want to tell 5 stories. I just want to bear witness to the truth. Number 1, we have to go back to summer 2010. Myself and my wife were both missionaries in London at the time, and we'd been married for almost a year. In July that year, we went on a retreat, a Charis staff retreat. Charis is the student movement that connects a lot of our communities. And it was a staff retreat in the Ardennes in Belgium. And Rachel had a cough for about 3 weeks, and it was driving me crazy. Never mind driving her crazy. She couldn't sleep because she was coughing all the time, and therefore I couldn't sleep. And we were on this retreat, she's lying in bed, still coughing, and I start to think to myself, it's been 3 weeks, why won't God just heal her? And then I think, maybe he hasn't healed her in these 3 weeks because he wants to teach her something. Maybe if she just works out what it is, then she'll get healed. And then I have this thought, maybe it's me that God's trying to get through to here. Maybe he wants to speak to me through this. And I have this thought that maybe I'm supposed to stand in the gap on her behalf. So I say to God, okay, Lord, I'm not going to go to sleep. I'm going to lie here and I'm going to pray for her until she stops coughing and she falls asleep. Okay, and if you want to speak to me, that will be, a clear sign that you're doing something, that you're interacting with me here while you're talking to me. Well, in less than a minute, she was asleep. Okay, which was within the last 3 weeks that hadn't happened. And so I'm thinking to myself, okay, God, are you looking to speak to me here? What are you looking to say to me? And as I was lying there praying, my mind, I think God drew my mind back to the previous 7 years. I was about to begin my 7th year of mission work in London. And he started speaking to me about how it wasn't an accident that he had me here, and that he was working in me, and he was doing something in me, and he was forming and training me. And then he drew my mind to this story in the Old Testament about Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Elijah thinks he's the last man standing. The whole country has turned from God, and he thinks he's the last man left. And he goes up against these bad guys, these prophets of Baal, and he wins. He defeats them all. But because the whole land has turned from God, it hasn't rained on the land for 3 years. There's been drought and there's been famine. And so he sits on the top of Mount Carmel, where he's just defeated all these hundreds of the prophets of Baal, and he prays. He kneels right down and he prays. And he says to his servant, go out to the edge of Mount Carmel and look out over the Mediterranean and tell me what you see. And 6 times the servant goes out and says, I just see blue sky. And he sends him again and again and again. On the 7th time he goes, he comes back and he says to Elijah, I see a cloud rising from the sea, no larger than a man's hand. And at this point Elijah says to his servant, go tell the king, who's also on the mountaintop, get off the mountain, the rains are coming. And at this moment, God says to me clearly, Mark, start running, the rain is coming. And I'm lying there. I said to God, if you want to speak to me, and he clearly said something to me. And I'm thinking to myself, what does that mean? What's God trying to say to me here? And the next morning, I make a list of everything that could mean. What does this mean, the rains that bring life? What could it be that God wants to do in me? How does he want to use me? And it's all to do with my work, all to do with the mission that I'm involved in, all to do with the students that I'm working with. And we leave the retreat. We flew to Krakow in Poland to go on to a training conference. And one of the open afternoons at this conference, we went into Krakow, just touring, shopping, etc. And we were in this little cafe. Rachel went to look for the bathroom as we were leaving. On the way down these little rickety stairs, she trips, falls, catches her foot on the stairwell, and tears all the ligaments along the front of her foot. And here we are in the middle of Poland at this conference, and she's completely unable to walk. And as you can see, the whole conference becomes a bit of a nightmare. We're in this school at this conference, and I spent the whole time trying to look after her. And on the last night of the conference, there's this big prayer meeting. And we're sitting at the back of the prayer meeting. I'm thinking to myself, Lord, it would be really cool if you just healed her during this prayer meeting. If you ever thinking that, you can think, man, that would look really good if that happened. And about 3/4 of the way through the prayer meeting, she looks at me and says, Mark, the pain in my foot's gone. She stands up, takes the bandage off. She hadn't stood on her foot in the last 5 days. And for about 15 minutes, there was completely no pain. She was completely healed. And then as the prayer meeting came to a close, she kind of gasped, sat back down, the blood drained from her face, and the pain fully returned. And it was like her foot had just been unhealed. And we were wondering to ourselves, what the heck, Lord? Did you just heal her foot and then unheal it again? This seems strange. And as we wondered and as we thought about it and talked about it, we knew that if God had just done this, he was telling us that 1, he could heal. And 2, he was telling us that he wasn't healing because he wanted us to learn something deeper about himself. The next 10 days, she couldn't put any weight on it at all. We travelled back, EasyJet back to Luton, taxi back to London. It was just it was not a fun journey. And for the next month almost, we couldn't leave the house. But once we were home, we realised that we simply had a lot more time for prayer. We had a lot more time to spend in God's presence. And we were learning some lessons about relying on him and being pushed back more into personal prayer. In October that year, foot was better, but it still wasn't. It was still a long way off being properly back to full health. The community that we were part of in London hosted a healing event that there was a man called Father John Ray had come across from New Zealand, and he was leading it. He was preaching it, and he had a known healing ministry. He's going to be with us in Belfast next month, running a set of healing meetings as a wee promotion. He has a very straightforward approach to praying for healing. He basically preaches in monotone for a while. I shouldn't speak badly of him before he arrives, but he preaches in a fairly monotone voice for a while, and then says, "Okay, everybody with sore feet, please stand up. In Jesus' name, be healed. Please sit down. Everybody with sore knees, please stand up. In Jesus' name, be healed. Please, And when he got to sore feet, I elbowed Rachel and said, "Stand up, stand up." So she stood up. In Jesus' name, be healed. Please sit down. And we kind of forgot about it because he's a very straightforward kind of guy. The next day, we were at church, and Rachel went to kneel down, and suddenly realised that she could kneel down. She hadn't done this in 3 months. And her foot had been completely healed. It seemed that God told us through this that one, he was able to heal it. We'd seen that in August. We'd seen that at this prayer meeting in August. But what was more important to him was relationship with us. And he wanted to show us through this process of healing that he was after a relationship with us. Number one. The rest of the stories are shorter. Number two. About 9 months after Rachel hurt her foot, and 8 months after the foot was healed, John arrived. There's no connections. John is now almost 3. And those of you who know John know that he is a pretty lively and active little boy. His entry to the world was pretty lively and active, 3 years, start to finish. After he was born, they left him in my arms and they took Rachel off to theatre, to surgery. That's not normal, apparently. She lost an estimated, I quote, 1.95 litres of blood. I think you have about 5 litres, doctors, you know. That's quite a lot to lose. Our haemoglobin count was down to 7 grams per 100 mils. Normal adult 16 grams per 100 mils. And it takes a while for that kind of level to go back up again. One doctor even said to us it could take 6 months, but at least takes some time for your haemoglobin to rise. Haemoglobin carries oxygen around the blood, gives you energy. Without haemoglobin, you're just knackered all the time. 2 weeks after this blood loss, she got her blood tested, and her haemoglobin levels were completely normal. We had a lot of people praying for us through that process. For us, that was a sign of God's intervention. Number 3, on the 29th of January 2013, it's a couple of years later, yeah, Rachel was again heavily pregnant with number 2 child. Remember that lesson we learned back in August 2010 about personal prayer time? And about that God was actually more fundamentally after relationship and us spending time with Him. We've tried to keep to that. We've tried to keep to that lesson, tried to keep it in our minds. Because life works better when you make space for God. On the Tuesday morning, I was at work, and Rachel was busy in the house and decided to sit down and make some time to pray. So she stopped the activity that she was doing and she made some time for God. While she was sitting and starting to pray, she realised that she wasn't quite so aware of the baby's movements. You know, you expect 10 movements per hour. Anything less than that, you start to think and count it. But especially for a baby that's 38 weeks, this was a little bit unusual, that he really wasn't moving much at all. So we went into the Royal, late morning, early afternoon, and they're all calm, they monitor you, they measure movements, they measure heart rate. His heart rate was fine, but his movements were slow, now about 1 per hour. Evening came, they sent me home. I was halfway through my pizza at 9 o'clock when I got a call that I had to get back in as fast as possible because his heart rate had either gone up or down. I can't remember which one. And they wanted to get him out as fast as possible. By 11:30 he was born. And after they resuscitated him, he started breathing, and they give you the baby and they take you into the post-operating room. And the surgeon came in to speak to us. And he said, he says, people like you are the reason we tell mothers to come in if they're worried about the baby's movements. If we hadn't begun that day in prayer, I don't think we would have realised that he wasn't moving. For us, another story of God's providence, His intervention and His healing. Number 4, after the wee guy was born, he was pretty small. He was 4 pounds something when he was born at 38 weeks. We got him home after a week in intensive care. But after 4 months, Dr. Milner at the neonatal ward sent us back into hospital. And he grew for about 3 months and then he just stopped. He just plateaued. And so we're back in the Royal, but this time it's worse. Because Rachel was breastfeeding, but she doesn't get a bed in the hospital and they're not able to cater for allergies. And that was one of the suspicions of what was wrong with them and all sorts. And it was a pretty hellish time. My mother, like all good mothers, had been nagging me for the last 4 months since he was born to get the wee guy baptised. And he was supposed to be baptised at St Bridget's 2 weeks after we went into hospital. So I spoke to Father Eddie and I said to Father Eddie, listen, I don't know if we'll actually make it because we're in the hospital right now, etc., etc. But on the Thursday of that week, they got discharged because he was now on a certain kind of milk formula and there wasn't any point staying in. They would just see how that goes and monitor him. That Sunday, he was baptised. And something happened to him on that day. Something changed in the wee guy. He basically started to grow. Now, I mean, babies who go to formula, they're supposed to grow, that's what you expect. And that's the hope. But one of the consultants that we saw a few months later, I think she was an immunologist. We've seen so many of them. I think if you could get frequent flyer miles for the Royal Car Park, I would be a gold member by now. But this consultant, she looked at his charts, she looked at us and she said, "That can't be right." And she got up and she went out to speak to the nurse that had just taken his weight to find out what the nurse had done wrong. Because basically to make sure that they actually measured him properly. And I didn't quite realise what had happened here until about 2 or 3 months ago when the health visitor was out to see him. And she basically said to us that she wanted to take a copy of his growth charts to show to her colleagues because she'd just never seen a child that had done this before. And it would probably shock them if she showed this to them. I think for us, again, God did something in that wee guy's life. So, number 5, back to John, child number 1. It was pretty clear when John was 6 months old that he had an acute allergy. You're probably getting the idea that God's done a lot in my life through my wee boys, yeah, by this point. I think it's my path to holiness. 6 months old, became aware that he had an acute allergy to cow's milk protein. So he'd come out in a rash when it touched his skin. If he swallowed it, his airways would narrow, his nose and eyes would stream. He would be quite violently sick, and he'd get this kind of mucousy, sore diarrhea. Really not very pleasant. And there's few things as hard as having to hold your little boy when he rocks back and forth just because he ate a chocolate ball that all the other kids had. And most kids grow out of milk protein allergies, but his responses seemed to be getting stronger. That was one of the hardest things to deal with, that it didn't seem to be changing, it just seemed to be getting worse. And we actually sat in this room over a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, when we came extremely close to calling an ambulance because he was clearly he was in shock and he was responding to something that he had eaten. And we were watching him and we came pretty close. It was during a Saturday gathering here where we have food and stuff, and he was pretty close. But at a certain point, the antihistamines kicked in. He perked up and he ran off, as he does. And typically, when a kid grows out of this, it takes at least a good few months, if not longer than that. And in early September last year, he had quite a bad reaction to something that he'd eaten. But over September, we just had a sense that we should fast and pray for him. So we did. And at the end of September, my wife thought that God told her, no, she didn't think that. God told her, she would say, that he had been healed. And so we tried. The only way you test for this stuff is you try them all. You basically trial them. And so you give him small amounts, you build it up, you see what happens. And he basically had zero reaction. And on Saturday of that week, he had his very first ice cream. He was completely healed and he has never looked back. He now helps himself to things from the fridge, to milk and cheese from the fridge. 5 stories: Rachel's cough in her foot, her hemoglobin, Joshua surviving, Joshua's growth, John's allergies. And all of them, God was doing something we did not expect. He was active, healing and teaching. In all the instances where he healed or protected our family, he was teaching us something more than just physical healing. He was doing something more with us than just physically interacting with us. He wanted us to know that he wanted to be involved in our life, and he is actually interested in us. The rains are coming. God said this to me that year, and that year when he said it, I talked about it, I preached about it, I even wrote articles for newsletters on what I thought God was meaning by that. I thought God was telling me about what he wanted to do through me. I thought he was speaking about the new life he wanted to bring into our mission, the new students that he wanted to bring to the outreach. On the day that John was born, I came home about 10 in the morning from hospital and went to bed for a couple of hours, got up sometime late morning, early afternoon, and I wanted to try and normalise my day. So I decided to have breakfast and then say my morning prayer. It was like 2 in the afternoon or something. And I prayed through a few Psalms, and then I looked up the reading that was set for the day. I go through a set readings over it runs for the whole course of a year. And you know what the reading was for that morning? Elijah and the prophets of Baal on the top of Mount Carmel. And I sat there astounded at what God was doing. I was way off in my opinion, in my estimation. I was thinking centimetres, God was in kilometres. I was in buckets and he was in rivers. I was thinking rain and he was raising the water table. I was thinking a few new people in the outreach and he was talking about new life in our family. God heals. That's very clear to me. It's also very clear that he is interested in far more than just physical healing. Well, that's important. He wants to be involved in the daily grind of my life. He wants to intervene and he wants me to know him. As I mentioned earlier, in a month's time, we will welcome Father John Ray to Belfast. He's coming for a number of evenings to do mission with us here and with a number of churches across Belfast. It'll be a time where we can expect God to act, to heal, to transform. But we can expect him not just to heal, but to draw people to himself, because that's what he's all about. We have 999 flyers for that week of mission. I have one of them, so that's why I only have 999. They're in a box here at the front. Please take a bunch of them away with you. Give them out, put them in churches, give them to your friends. They give details of the 3 dates and the locations. Come be involved on those nights. Pray for people on them. Father John prays for people. He also invites people to pray for others as well on that night. And as I said, invite people to come yourself and expect God to work with you. Thanks very much.